Crank up. Okay, welcome everybody. We're here again for our lunchtime program. Got a really good one today set up. CW5 Chris Braund has put quite a bit together on the Battle of Midway. As much as I thought I knew about it, I've even learning a lot more from his presentation. So yeah, we get to we'll come up on the anniversary of the battle, of course, too. So, all right, so CW5 Braund, come on up and tell us about Midway.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I really do appreciate you spending your lunch with us here at the Aviation Museum, and again, for the library and the museum for hosting us. It's not every day somebody gets a chance to stand up and talk about the thing that got them into history. You know, every historian has a thing that piques their interest. And for me, it was the Battle of Midway. So bear with me, you know, if I start getting overwhelmed with joy and kind of, you know, start getting a little giddy on you, but literally the thing that got me into studying history is the Battle of Midway. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. Things were not going so well. 1941, 1942. You're looking at December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor's bombed. And moving right into 1942, things are not looking much better. So Admiral Chester Nimitz takes over towards the end of the year, and he's faced with a huge dilemma. He's only got a few aircraft carriers. He's only got a few ships, support ships. So what is he to do? Well, Admiral Nimitz is known throughout history as a guy that takes something called a calculated risk. And calculated risk is going to tie directly into the Battle of Midway. And as you can see, what he's thinking of already, the whole course of this war is going to be decided by these next couple days. He knows that if he fails, America's going to lose. But if he succeeds, sky's wide open for him. So Admiral Nimitz, again, takes over towards the end of the year and immediately gets to work gathering what supplies he has. He has to rebuild the fleet he has and get everybody ready to get more of an offensive posture. He's got a very positive attitude, despite when he takes over, there's still sunken ships in the harbor. There's still burning fires on the Arizona. So he's got a lot of obstacles in his way. However, he keeps a positive attitude, and that infectious kind of attitude he has starts tying into how this battle starts to take off. So as I said, things are not looking good. December 7th, 1941. Everybody knows that as Pearl Harbor. But it wasn't just Pearl Harbor. The Japanese, through complex planning, launched the entire Pacific campaign on December 7th. And by the end, you see 3 days later, the island of Guam was lost. Wake Island, a couple weeks later. Now, if I can encourage you to pursue studies other than Midway today, I would highly encourage everybody to look at the stand that the Americans made on Wake Island. Desperate times, desperate measures, and these guys held out from December 7th to December 23rd. Very heroic battle. And it wasn't just the Americans. They launched it on the Allies. So what you see is the British surrendering at Singapore, Dutch East Indies, and then finally the Philippines were lost. So by mid-1942, the balance of the war was waning. We had no idea what was going to happen. And here's a graphic depiction of all those battles. Starting right here, December 7th, 1941. And again, you see everywhere the Japanese hit almost simultaneously. And that just gives to show you a little bit of the complexity that the Japanese put in their plans. And as we develop Midway a little bit more, you are going to see that their complexity actually comes back to haunt them. And then by 1942, this is how much territory the Japanese actually controlled. And they were not satisfied with that either. Japanese wanted to take control of this area, these islands, cut America off from Australia. They were eyeballing Midway and eyeballing the Aleutian Islands. Big thing about the Aleutian Islands, you'll note what state that's connected to. So that's actually American territory back then. Not a state yet, but territory back then for sure. All right, so let's talk about some of the things that led up. Because like a battle, battles happen for a reason. Conditions are set, battles executed. So some of the things that led up. If you were here last month, you heard about this one. 18 April 1942, the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. This was the first raid on Japanese soil in centuries. Japanese were thinking they were invincible. 16 B-25 bombers showed up over Tokyo and different places around Japan and proved otherwise. The next big lead up, Battle of Coral Sea. Now we're going to take a couple minutes here to talk about the Battle of Coral Sea. Battle of Coral Sea, direct correlation kind of with all of these and with some of the previous battles we just talked about. Battle of Coral Sea goes down in history as the very first time fleets fought without actually seeing each other. So what we have a pivotal moment in strategy and a pivotal moment in military history where no longer are navies defined by their battleships, cruisers, destroyers. Navies are now being defined by their aircraft carriers. And that's something the Japanese kind of forced on us with all their the damage they conducted on our battleships at Pearl Harbor. But it was also something that the Japanese had embraced early in warfare. And we were forced to come in kind of late at it. So Coral Sea, the battle between the aircraft carriers. And the big reason we had a battle down there is this supply route right here. Lifeline to Australia. And not only the lifeline to Australia, but once you get past Australia, it's everything else in the China, Burma, India theater. So this supply route is a huge necessity to maintain. So Nimitz, once again, the calculated risk and the ability to go ahead and put the faith in his admirals, his carrier admirals, heard of a fleet, a Japanese naval fleet dispatching into the Coral Sea for the sole purpose of making moves in Port Moresby and some of the further islands here in an eventual strike against Australia. So Nimitz dispatched what aircraft carriers he had. Now, this is where these two tie together. Two aircraft carriers were being used for this, the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet. All Nimitz had at his disposal was the USS Yorktown and the USS Lexington. One other carrier in the Pacific is on its way back to the West Coast because it was torpedoed in early 1942 by the Japanese. That was the USS Saratoga. So in the days of 7 and 8 May 1942, the aircraft of both fleets met over the skies of the Coral Sea. By the end of the 8th of May 1942, the Japanese had lost one small carrier and the Americans had lost one of their big carriers, the USS Lexington. But the result, Japan did not take any territory here and had to retreat. So no longer was Japan an imminent threat here. However, this is where we start to see a divide. We start to see a divide in the command of the Japanese. Japanese combined fleet had one mission only. They were looking to destroy the American Pacific Fleet that they failed they didn't do at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Naval Command back in Tokyo, they had one goal. They wanted this territory to cut off Australia, to cut off the supply lines. The Army, the Japanese Imperial Army had their own mission, and none of it jived with anything the Navy or the Naval Chiefs of Staff in Tokyo wanted to do. So all sorts of conflicting orders, conflicting operations, all starting to come together when this failed operation in the Coral Sea occurred. Now the next question is, how did the Navy know that the Japanese were working down here? There's one thing that the Japanese didn't have that we had. Our early code breakers, our early cryptologists, our early cyber warriors, if you want to say. The cyber warriors actually started to win us some battles. These two in particular. You had Edwin Layton and Joseph Rochefort. These two guys worked in a basement in Pearl Harbor, and together they were able to break the Japanese naval code. Now, the big deal about the Japanese naval code in itself, we were able to get transmissions what the Japanese were sending each other. However, we were also able to get Japanese ship movements. Now, when I say ship movements, I'm not talking about luxury liners going out for pleasure. we got where the Japanese carriers were going to be, where the Japanese combined fleet was going to be. And we got that for Coral Sea. That's how we were able to know, and we were able to meet them at Coral Sea. The next big code they broke was going to happen on June 4th, 1942. That was going to be Midway. They had broken the code. The Japanese were seeking to make a decisive blow at Midway. We knew ship composition, we knew who was leading it, and we knew the different task forces. Like I mentioned earlier, Japan's plan against Midway was an overly complex plan to seize the Aleutian Islands and seize Midway. So again, why Midway? Seems like a pretty insignificant piece of territory. If you can even see it on this map, Pacific Ocean's huge. So what was the big deal about Midway Island? Well, you can kind of say it's in the name, right? Midway. Midway Island. It's the last of the long chain of the Pearl Harbor off of Hawaii. So it's a pretty big strategic location. It had an airfield on it. It's an unsinkable aircraft carrier. The ability to put land-based planes on here would give the Japanese the ability to bomb Pearl Harbor. And then eventually to put their own airplanes on Midway, their own airplanes on Hawaii. And then eventually their long-term goal was to get America to surrender, to give them free reign of everything out here. So Midway was a pretty important piece of territory. Now, to Admiral Yamamoto, the overall combined leader of the overall admiral of the combined fleet, his main goal, nothing down here, his main goal was to operate in this area in an attempt to draw the American fleet out, to finally end what he wanted to end at Pearl Harbor. The whole reason he bombed Pearl Harbor was to destroy the American Pacific Fleet. He failed to do so. He failed to get the carriers. All but 2 of the battleships that had been sunk or beached at Pearl Harbor had been raised. So he needed a big, decisive action. And that is what he was hoping for at Midway. He was hoping his taking of Midway would draw the Pacific Fleet out in one big, decisive battle. A lot of assumptions there. A lot of assumptions that A, we didn't know what he was doing, and B, how would we react? So a lot of, not many facts went into his planning, but definitely a lot of assumptions. So again, looking at where Midway Island is, smack dab in the middle of the Pacific, hence the word Midway. Here's what it looks like today. Back then, this would have been Eastern Island. This would have been Sand Island. This is the original runway that was there in 1942. This has been built more recently. And there's what it looked like on the eve of battle. As you can see, Eastern Island right here, Sand Island right there. And here's what Yamamoto was trying to destroy. This is all the American forces could muster for this battle. Nimitz understood carrier doctrine. He understood what his carriers could do. So he put all the eggs in one basket by sending everything he had to go take care of this operation. Now, knowing that if he had battleships involved, the battleships would slow his carriers. Carriers are very fast, very maneuverable for their size. So Nimitz, in gambling his carriers, actually sent his battleships back to the West Coast to get them out of the way, just in case. So what Nimitz did, he broke his aircraft carriers into 2 task forces. Yorktown, still licking its wounds from the Battle of Coral Sea, sailed back into Pearl Harbor to be repaired. What somebody said was supposed to take months. He ordered them to get the Yorktown fixed in 72 hours for it to be turned around and go right back out to sea. Admiral Spruance was going to take out the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet. Now, Admiral Spruance, he was actually a fill-in. He wasn't even the admiral supposed to go. This task force, Task Force 16, actually fell under Admiral Bull Halsey. Now, Admiral Halsey, for those of you that don't know much about him, he is the Navy's equivalent to a General Patton and how aggressive he is. And he has grown up around naval aviation. He has commanded ships, and now he's commanding task forces. He was a very aggressive commander. The problem was he was so aggressive that he kind of worked himself into a skin disease by not sleeping, living off of cigarettes and coffee. So he was kind of put down on quarters, and this was the recommended replacement for him. So Admiral Spruance was going to take out the USS Hornet, the USS Enterprise first. Once repairs were complete, Admiral Fletcher was going to take the USS Yorktown and his ships to meet at what they were going to call Point Luck. Now, after the intercepts were broken, we knew exactly where the Japanese were going to be. But we didn't exactly 100% know where or what their actions were going to be. We knew they were going to attack Midway. We knew how many carriers were going to be there. We knew they were going to move on the Aleutian Islands. But we wanted to play caution. So what we did is we sent these ships to a point north of Midway, just in case the actual target was the Aleutian Islands. And then they were also in position if they had to take care of Midway. So that point was actually called Point Luck. That was going to be the meeting point that these two carrier commanders were going to meet, and then Admiral Fletcher was going to take over the entire operation. All right, let's talk about the carrier-based planes. These planes that were going to fight the Battle of Midway were all pre-war naval aircraft. They were all designed in the interwar period, and by the time World War II kicked off, they were already obsolete compared to what the Japanese were flying. So let's take a peek at some of them. The SBD-3 Dauntless. This is actually the hero of the battle, and we're going to kind of break this down, and we're going to talk about why these guys were the heroes. And it's not necessarily the airplane, but it's the aviators that flew these airplanes, turned them in. All right, there it is actually during the battle. The TBD-1 Devastator. Oldest airplane the Navy had at this point. It was a slow, lumbering torpedo bomber that flew about 100 miles an hour. Its tactic was to take off from the carrier, fly really, really low, and hopefully hit its target with the torpedo that was woefully outdated and oftentimes didn't shoot straight and oftentimes didn't detonate when it actually did hit a target. So that's what these guys were climbing into. And what you see right here, this is one of the last pictures of the squadron called VT-8. And we're actually going to talk about VT-8 a little bit. VT-8 departed from the USS Hornet, and not a single airplane came back. 15 aircraft departed from the USS Hornet. 0 airplanes came back. 1 crew member survived. 1 pilot survived. F4F-4 Wildcat. This was the fighter cover. Again, woefully outgunned, highly unmaneuverable compared to the Japanese airplanes, but our pilots better trained at this point. They knew how to use this airframe to their advantage, and that'll come up a couple times. And there it is departing on the day of the Battle of Midway. All right, so it wasn't just the Navy. It wasn't just the 3 aircraft carriers that were involved. Midway, after Midway was attacked on December 7th, the Americans started pumping aircraft into it for its defense. So you had a mishmash of Marine Corps, Navy, and Army Air Force, all crammed on these small islands. You had the Vindicator, just about as old as the TBD Devastator. And there it is departing on its mission on June 4th, 1942. The Buffalo probably should have been grounded the day after it was left the production line. It was probably one of the worst fighters ever developed, and it had just about less than a year of service life by the time the Navy said, yeah, we need something new. B-17 bombers. Everybody knows the heroes of Midway were the B-17s, right? We're going to talk about how the Army thought so. Here they are on Midway Island departing. TBF Avenger. This is where things get complex if you get into the nerdy naval stuff like I do sometimes. These guys were actually part of VT-8, that squadron that lost all of their aircraft at Midway. These guys were a contingent that were fielding this brand new TBF Avenger. When the USS Hornet was an East Coast-based aircraft carrier, and when it was dispatched to the West Coast, a detachment of VT-8 stayed behind to field these aircraft. These aircraft were then sent out to Pearl Harbor and then eventually sent out to Midway. So you had 6 of these aircraft, part of VT-8, the same VT-8 that were flying the Devastators, on the Hornet sitting at Midway. And this is the only one that returned. So if you think of, you hear the word lone survivor when it comes to VT-8, there were actually 3 lone survivors. You had 1 pilot from the TBD Devastators and then 2 crew members from the Lone Avenger that came back. And more Midway-based aircraft. B-26 Marauder set up, these are medium bombers. So think of when we talked about the B-25 during the Doolittle raid. This is the same style, same kind of frame aircraft. So it's made for bombing. So we slap a torpedo on it. And we teach high altitude bombers how to do torpedo runs. And I didn't put an actual picture of it in combat. What I put a picture of is what the B-26 was known for during this mission. All right? Only a couple of them actually returned from the mission, but one of them is so famous that a painting was done on him. He dropped his torpedo. Torpedo failed to hit the actual aircraft carrier, but the pilot went the length of the flight deck strafing it while he was departing that carrier. Pretty fascinating story. Older model Dauntlesses flown by the Marine Corps. Older model Wildcats flown by the Marine Corps on Midway. And then the infamous PBY Catalina. This is the aircraft right here and the crew that actually started the Battle of Midway. These guys were aloft, and you're going to see the timeline, but these are the guys that spotted the aircraft coming into Midway, and this crew right here, the same crew is the one that spotted the fleet that dispatched Midway's aircraft and dispatched the battle groups, the carrier battle groups aircraft. 1 aircraft. Now the Japanese. So the point of these slides is to show you what the Americans were up against. You saw the one slide of what the Americans had. 3 aircraft carriers and kind of a handful of ships. Here's what the Japanese had. Under 3 different task forces. You had the Carrier Strike Force. The Carrier Strike Force's mission was to bomb Midway. Set the conditions for the occupation force. And their support force was led by Admiral Yamamoto, who was in charge of the entire operation, was behind both of these. He was coming from the south, straight through the Central Pacific, and he was right behind this task force. But that wasn't enough. You had support ships, you had support groups, you had support submarines, you had the Aleutians, the guys that were going up north to take care of the Aleutian Islands. You had their force. Each one of them had a separate island they were going to. They had a support force, and they had a force of submarines. Again, an overall complex plan that any modern military leader will look at and realize when we got there, Japanese failed one major thing to do. They forgot to concentrate forces. All right, the concentration of forces, if they would have put everything they had against Midway Island, who knows how it would have turned out. You know, we could play the what if all day long, but because they split forces there, forces here, forces coming down, another force in the back, who knows what would have happened. So again, going back to what the Japanese had. All right, we talked about all their different forces, submarines. Submarines are pretty big to the Japanese. This was their eyes out there. This was to let them know, hey, who's coming? The problem is I'm going to show you the timeline of the Japanese submarines. The Japanese submarines were actually in place to stop any American carriers that might have reacted to this. The problem was they got there 2 days too late. So the Americans were already past them by the time the Japanese submarines showed up. All right, Japanese naval aircraft. The famous Zero. All right, a lot of people have heard about the Zero. Very maneuverable, very nimble. However, American pilots realized that all that speed and agility had a trade-off. Its lack of armor, its lack of self-sealing fuel tanks. So all you would need to do is hit it right around this area and it would blow up. We discovered that pretty early in the war. Kate torpedo and high-level bomber. And then the D3A Val. It's the equivalent of our TBD, or the equivalent of our SBD dive bomber. All right, so we went over the overall picture of Midway, what the actual battle was meant to do. The carrier strike force was supposed to come in, set the conditions on Midway for the invasion force. The main force was supposed to come forward in hope that the American fleet would respond, and the main force would be there to put it to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. However, what the Japanese did not know is as they're moving, our carriers are moving. And we are sitting right up here again in that place called Point Luck. Japanese had no idea we were showing up for this battle. This is part of that calculated risk. This is part of Admiral Nimitz saying, look, I will risk everything I have if I know I have the advantage. And definitely Nimitz had the advantage. He knew where, when, and what they were bringing for this battle. So here's our timeline starting on June 3rd, 1942. Here's that Japanese submarine screen sets up right around June 3rd. Here's where the aircraft carriers were on June 3rd. Submarines missed them just by a few days. There's our first bit of luck we got in this battle. We actually got quite a bit of luck in this battle. The morning of June 3rd, 04 and 09, PBY search planes are out there looking for the Japanese fleet. Again, we know where they are. General area, not the exact location, but we know kind of a general area where they are. So we send out a group of PBYs, long range, just looking, and a clockwise fan, just looking for the force. At 09 in the morning on June 3rd, the support force transport group, this is the force that is supposed to come in after Admiral Nagumo's carriers take care of anything on Midway Island. This is one of the first key decisions in our leadership during the battle. Nimitz receives word that, hey, we have found the, quote, main body. Nimitz, trusting his code breakers, trusting Rochefort and Layton, says, no, this is not what we're looking for. This is the support force. Hold fast, do not launch on this. So think about the moments in time. If Nimitz would have launched everything he had at this, there would have been nothing protecting Midway. There would have been nothing protecting carriers. So this, without Nimitz making that hard decision, again, who knows how this battle would have turned out. And then on June 4th, 1942, 5:45 in the morning, that PBY I talked about earlier made contact. Not with the fleet yet, but made contact with 108 Japanese airplanes that had already departed at 4 in the morning from their own carriers. They were en route to bomb Midway. The Japanese, or excuse me, the PBY flew just a little bit further after reporting, and lo and behold, there were 2 aircraft carriers sitting in his flight path. Nimitz called it the most important contact of the battle. That 5:45 report triggered the death of the Japanese Navy that day. When he reported back, Midway Island scrambled. So you have the B-26s, B-17s, TBFs, SBDs, all those aircraft scramble at once. All the fighter planes come up to meet. A big battle was about to ensue. What you had is you had an intercept of all of our fighter planes against the Japanese. Sadly, most of our fighter planes were wiped out. Again, we're flying outdated and not very maneuverable against the best of the Japanese. So our fighter planes were kind of eliminated, allowing the Japanese to still come in and bomb Midway. However, the problem was what the Japanese bombed. The Japanese put a hurting on Sand Island. You know, the hangars, the oil tankers, some of the facilities. But what they failed to do was take out Eastern Island, which is where the airfield resides. So during this strike, the strike leader of the Japanese aircraft radios back to his commander. Strike leader radios back to Admiral Nagumo and says, hey, we didn't accomplish the mission. We need a second strike on the island. This is where the battle, this is what's called Admiral Nagumo's dilemma. Japanese doctrine and Yamamoto's orders to Nagumo was you will launch half of your force to attack. The other part of your force will be ready to attack ships if they show up. So below decks on the 4 aircraft carriers, you had a complement of torpedo bombers and armor-piercing bomb-loaded bombers in the event the American carrier showed up. Nagumo had to make a split-second decision. Am I gonna stay with the orders of the day, or am I going to launch these aircraft? Am I going to rearm these aircraft, take off the torpedoes, take off the armor-piercing bombs, and put on high explosives? He makes the decision. He decides to take off the torpedoes, the armor-piercing bombs. He decides to get these aircraft ready for a second strike on Midway, right when the Midway-based aircraft come in. So Admiral Nagumo now sees airplanes coming, but he notices they are not carrier-based aircraft. He still feels pretty confident that the American aircraft carriers are nowhere to be found. So far, the plan as planned is going through. So the first of the aircraft that come in are those TBF Avengers, torpedo bombers. They come in at low level, launch their torpedoes, 0 hits. The next to come in, the B-26s, low level, 0 hits. Next, 20,000 feet in the air, the B-17s come in, drop all their bombs, 0 hits. Then you have the Marine Corps dive bombers coming in, 0 hits. So at this point, the Japanese are feeling pretty confident about what they have going on. Hey, no carrier-based aircraft are coming at us. Continue to get ready for the next phase. Continue to get ready to rearm and strike Eastern Island. That way, whatever's coming at me, what they know is coming from that island, is going to stop. But what he doesn't know were the carriers. The carriers also got the message that Nagumo's fleet was out there. And at 07 in the morning, they began launching their flights. Each carrier had a complement of 1 torpedo bomber squadron, 2 dive bombing squadrons, and 1 fighter squadron. And they all began to scramble. The USS Hornet, USS Enterprise launched first. The USS Yorktown held back from launching because it was going to recover its own strike aircraft. And that's actually going to become kind of a big deal later because they're going to get a more accurate description of where the actual fleet is. So their aircraft can actually take a more direct route. But the Hornet and the Enterprise go based off of everything they have. So if you can focus your attention, I know it's a difficult map to look at, but right up here you got all the aircraft carriers. These routes are the different routes the aircraft took. All right, each carrier had their own doctrine how they were going to launch their airframes. All right, not going to get into it too much, but each one had, are we going to launch as a flight, as in this set launches, they loiter, wait for the next group, they loiter, and then all go as a flight. Another carrier had the doctrine of you take off, you go, and then you link up at a certain other area. That's kind of some of the differences that made this battle turn out. So the USS Hornet's battle group, the USS Hornet's air wing, started flying out on a westerly heading. Wrong direction. When the fleet was reported way down here. They took off in a westerly heading. Probably within about an hour of this flight, the torpedo bomber squadron, reasons known but to him and now the depths of the Pacific, he decided we're going the wrong way. I am breaking off from my fighter protection and I am breaking off from the torpedo or from the dive bombers. And this is his route of flight. At 8:25, he makes a left-hand turn and happens to stumble right on the Japanese fleet. This is VT-8. VT-8 goes in unprotected, 1,500 feet at 100 miles an hour against everything the Japanese had. Remember, the Japanese were on alert. They were already being bombed. They were already being torpedoed by the Midway-based aircraft. So they were ready for it. So their screening ships saw it. Screening ships passed it back to the carrier. The carrier dispatched its combat air patrol of Zeros. The Zeros, from 10 to 12,000 feet, came down on top of the torpedo bombers. And the only thing the torpedo bombers could do to defend themselves was fly straight, fly low, and hope the .30 caliber machine gunner in the back could shoot down a couple. That's all these guys had. And one by one, they were picked off. Until one guy got his torpedo off. He missed. He was shot down. Lone survivor. That was Ensign George Gay. He's actually got a book out there called Lone Survivor. A fascinating read, because at the end of the day, George Gay's bobbing in the waters watching the Battle of Midway. We've got a first-hand account from a guy who was actually there, probably about a mile away, watching. Woo, fascinating. All right. So that is VT6. VT8. VT3, the other torpedo bomber squadrons. And then also VT6 don't have any more luck. They all go in unprotected. And they both have the exact same results. Only problem is at least 1 to 2 per squadron get back. So let's go ahead and break this down even a little bit more. We talked about how outdated the torpedo bombers were. 41 total were launched that day of the Japanese fleet. 4 returned. And that's not saying the pilots were recovered. That's 4 crews returned. Remember, VT8 out of 15 aircraft, none came back. And then also their land-based contingent, only 1 came back. When the torpedo attacks were done, since 07 in the morning, the Japanese fleet had been under attack. Torpedo bombers, high-level bombers, dive bombers, you name it. Everything was thrown up against them. 94 aircraft total, 0 hits at this point. You're Nagumo, you're feeling pretty confident. Your scout planes have found nothing, except for the 1 scout that was late taken off. That's the side part of the story. Japanese sent out their own scouts, just in case there was something out there. One of their scout planes was 30 minutes late taking off. And guess what it found in the time between all of these attacks? The report back. They had found the carrier. They had found the American fleet. And now Nagumo's dilemma. Remember, he's switching his munitions on his aircraft. He's in the middle of taking torpedoes off, storing them on the side, taking armor-piercing bombs off, getting everybody ready for a second strike at Midway. And now he's presented, whoa, the United States Navy's here. They're not supposed to be here. So he has to make a rash decision. He has to make a quick decision. And he makes a decision to stop. Stop rearming my aircraft. Recover the Midway strike group. Refuel, rearm, send them against the Americans. Very precious time. So he recovers all the aircraft. These aircraft are being refueled, being armed for shipborne operations. So now they're being armed with torpedoes, armor-piercing bombs. So this is where the story kind of sits right now as the torpedo bombers are attacking, as the Midway strike crew's going away, and at 10:20 in the morning, the Japanese luck finally runs out. Because that's when something else appears over the skies, and let's talk about that. The Duel of Fates. It's a fancy way of saying a great game of cat and mouse between the United States Navy submarine and a Japanese destroyer. This submarine was shadowing the fleet, the Japanese fleet. It would come up to periscope depth, it would get spotted and come back down. Come back up to periscope depth, find the fleet, it would get spotted, they would try to bomb it, it would come back down. For 2 hours, it played this game with the Japanese carriers, Japanese cruisers, Japanese destroyers. So this one ship, the destroyer Arashi, stayed behind as the rest of the fleet moved off. Stayed behind to try to destroy. His goal was to keep this guy below periscope depth to allow his fleet to get by. So after 2 hours, when he no longer heard a ping, meaning he no longer detected the submarine, he thought his mission was complete. He thought he'd either destroyed it or scared it away. So he turned around and did what in the Navy they call flank speed. That is full speed. He was heading back to his carrier battle group, cutting a V in the water as he was going. It kind of looked like an arrow. You had it coming off the bow. You could see it right here. He had it coming off the bow and then the back of the ship. So he's creating an arrow. Anybody see where I'm going with this? He's creating an arrow in the water. He just so happened to create this arrow when these guys right here VB6 and VS6. These are the torpedo bombing, or I'm sorry, these are the dive bombers from the USS Enterprise. They are at a point right here where they're like, we either have to turn back or we have to make a decision on what we're going to do. The commander of this air wing, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, makes a decision. I'm going to make a sweeping right turn just to see if there's anything out there. And this sweeping right turn, as he's going, he looks down. Anybody know what he finds? He sees the arrow in the water. He makes the decision, that guy's going somewhere. I wonder where this guy's going. Let's follow him. And as he's following this ship, going full steam back to the carriers, off in the distance, he sees the smoke. He sees the actions that have been going on with VT6, VT8, the smoke screens that are going. He sees that in the distance, and he knows he's found them. At the same time he's doing that, VB3, the Enterprise, or I'm sorry, the Yorktowns, who had launched direct from their carrier. Remember, they launched an hour later. They had launched directly to the carrier. All of these guys were about to meet at the exact same time over top of the Japanese fleet. There it is right there. This is an artist. This would be an amazing picture if that was true, though. All aircraft met at the exact same time. All of the dive bombers, just pure fate, met over top of the Japanese fleet. Within a matter of minutes, 3 of the 4 aircraft carriers were on fire. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were all on fire, sinking. The only one that survived the initial attack was the Hiryu. The Hiryu was a little bit further north as they were all maneuvering away from the different airplanes. So within a matter of minutes, the Pacific War took a dramatic turn from the Japanese going more into the American favor. However, still one aircraft carrier that could do damage. And that one aircraft carrier got the reports of that late departing Japanese scout plane. The Hiryu launched everything it could at what they found, which would have been the USS Yorktown. Here's the route it took. Both torpedo bombers and dive bombers took off after the USS Yorktown. And here's the death of the USS Yorktown. 08:15, it was discovered. By noon, the bombers were over top. By 12, the torpedo bombers. And by later in the afternoon, it was abandoned. She was sitting dead in the water, beginning to list. Not sinking yet, though. Damage control boarded and tried to save it. You could see all the different places it was hit. Here, torpedoed, and then damage control. The 5th of June, the next day, the USS Yorktown was spotted, again by scout planes. And later that day, on the 6th, she was torpedoed again. But it wasn't just her. Now it was the damage control boat that was sitting next to it. It was torpedoed as well. Immediately broke in half and sank. The USS Yorktown held on for another day before it finally sunk. So we lost the USS Yorktown during the Battle of Midway. But by the end of the day, we had actually come back on 4 June and actually sunk that ship. So by the end of 4 June, 1942, what looked like a lost cause in the Pacific turned into the bulk of the Japanese carrier strike fleet now in the bottom of the Pacific. Now, let's talk about the aftermath and what kind of happened in this. The Army tried to take credit for this victory. The Army Air Force sat there with smiling faces at the Officers Club on Pearl Harbor, bragging about how wonderful they had done. You think that went over well with the Navy guys? No, there's some documented brawls that occurred between these aviators. Fascinating stories as well. So as you can see right there, even the New York Times tried to help the Army Air Force get the credit for it. There they are, smiling. Just like, look at us, man. We just won the Battle of Midway for everybody. Well, unfortunately, their gun cameras were rolling. There's the aircraft carrier. There's their bomb. There's the aircraft carrier. There's their bombs. There's the aircraft carrier. There's their bombs. Did they win the Battle of Midway? Not so much. The story of VT8, we talked about these guys. The heroic sacrifice these guys did. Now, understanding their role, all right? They understood their role was to go in low, go in slow, and try to put a torpedo into a ship. What they didn't know, what their sacrifice did was it gave the dive bombers free rein. And what I mean by that, when these guys appeared, remember they had no fighter cover. They had no dive bombers above them. So the Japanese fighters concentrated on these guys. That brought the Japanese fighters down from high altitude down to low altitude. And this is where the Japanese fighters were, taking care of all the torpedo squadrons when the dive bombers appeared. When the dive bombers appeared, there was no fighter opposition above to tangle with them. So they were able to free rein, come down and bomb the Japanese. So while these guys, you know, their mission almost seemed suicidal, but their sacrifice didn't go in vain. This is all the pilots of VT8. This is their commander, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. This is the only guy that survived. That's Ensign George Gay. He's the guy that was bobbing in the water and watching the battle unfold. Here's the overall aftermath. We lost the Yorktown. We lost the Hammond, which was the damage control ship. 145 aircraft, 307 men. Japanese, though, look at their loss. All four of their carriers, one heavy cruiser, 292 aircraft, 2,500 casualties. It wasn't necessarily the aircraft that they lost. It wasn't the pilots that they lost. They lost their maintainers. They lost all of those guys that knew how to maintain these airframes. And they were never able to recover from that. They were never able to rebuild their Navy, rebuild their Air Force, because they didn't have the same infrastructure that we had back home. So they weren't able to recuperate or recover from this operation. Moreover, we halted their expansion in the Pacific. Never again was Japan able to push forward like they had done before the Battle of Midway. We put them on the defensive. More importantly, we set the conditions for our first offensive in the Pacific War. We took the offensive on the battle and what would turn into the Battle of Guadalcanal, just sitting right in this area right here. So with that, Battle of Midway, pretty important battle in military history, naval history, army history for, you know, failures of what they thought they were trying to take credit for. But Battle of Midway, it's one of those battles. Everybody's heard Midway. But then when you realized how everything came together and how America won that battle, truly amazing piece of military history. And up here, these are all the references I used to write this slideshow. Some of them are light reads, some of them will take you a while, they're very technical. But I highly encourage, if anything up here today has sparked an interest in anything, pick up something about the Battle of Wake Island, and definitely the Battle of Midway. When you read about the stories of these aviators and the crewmen who went in without any regard for their own safety, just to ensure the mission was complete. That is the real story of the Battle of Midway. The decisions and the actions of those that were actually there. All right, this time I'll open the floor up for any kind of questions. I think I have, what do I have? I got 9 minutes. Oh, you got a good one, I know.
Which of those books do you think is the most interesting?
What kind of story? Do you want a story or do you want factual type of information? What would you like?
Story.
The story. All right, Stay of the Rising Sun. That is the story of the USS Yorktown at Midway. So you'll get a kind of a timeline of how the Yorktown operated. That is a great story. Another story, No Right to Win. Those are actually snippets of oral histories by the guys that fought at Midway. So that's a real good book for stories as well. Anybody else?
Carriers, or the fleet was spotted. How did Nimitz know that was a support group and he was going to be attacked?
How did he? Because he trusted his intelligence guys. His intelligence guys told him it was coming in 3 different waves. And he knew where the strike force should be. And when this one was spotted where it was, he knew that wasn't going to be the carrier strike force. So that's where he made that decision.
How long after Pearl Harbor did he take command?
He took command. Admiral Husband Kimmel was fired pretty much immediately, and he was on station right around Christmas, a little bit after Christmas. And then already then, starting in January, February, March, he was already pushing his carriers out to make small attacks. So he was already attacking Wake Island again. He was already making small carrier strikes. He was just waiting for opportunities, what he called his calculated risk, to send things to Coral Sea and then to Midway, the big attacks. So yeah. Anybody else?
Talk a little bit about the four carriers and the condition they were in, having to hurriedly go out there for this battle.
The American ones?
No, the Japanese.
The Japanese? Yeah. All right, so Japanese carriers, again, a very complex machinery and how these guys are operated. The actual carrier strike group that attacked Midway should have been a 6-carrier strike group. 2 of those carriers were dispatched to the Battle of Coral Sea. Those are the 2 biggest carriers, or some of the biggest carriers they had. That had been the Shuikaku and the Zuikaku. These 2 ships would have probably been the deciding factor. They were actually, one was damaged, and the other one had its complementary aircraft kind of decimated during the Battle of Coral Sea, so they weren't able to participate. But the thing to note about the 4 that were actually there, that very first slide that I showed you where it showed all those strikes, that was done by those carriers. Those carriers never went back into port. So they were depleted morale, provisions. You had a tired crew that had not been back to port since November 1920, or November of 1941, because they were the actual same carrier battle group that was going around attacking all these different places. So that's something different between Japan and us. We would battle, go home, and then resortie. They just stayed out. Pretty important lesson. Is that what you were trying to get at? Yeah. All right.
Was there frustration when they launched from the 2 American aircraft carriers? Said one just went after the other, and they had to like go around and around until everybody got together. Was there frustration by the pilots?
Absolutely, especially. That was the big one. Why you saw the Enterprise, the USS Enterprise, the VB6 and the VS6, the guys McCluskey. If McCluskey would have been in the same kind of configuration that, say, the USS Hornet, the way they did their departures, the USS Hornet was the ones that made everybody circle and wait and then join and then go. The Enterprise was the one that said you depart and you meet. If McCluskey would have had to wait for everybody to form up, he would have never been able to do what he did to do that sweeping turn. But yeah, absolutely it was frustrating, especially the Hornet. Now the part that I didn't get into was, you didn't hear me talk about VS8 or VB8 because they got lost. They got lost and never found the Japanese fleet. And then they in turn had to go back. Same thing with their fighter planes.
Why did that strafing that one bomber did not count as a hit?
What about it? Like,
why didn't it count as a hit in
The bombing. Yeah.
Because it was just, I don't think he actually did any damage to the carrier. It was more of a, shaking his fist at him, going down, saying, hey, watch me, kind of watch how good I am. And then he just kind of went down and his nose gunner strafed as they were going down, and then he departed and left. That picture that I had up here, the Army trying to take credit, that's the crew right there. That's the crew that actually did that. All right.
You're going to tell about Hollywood's attempt on telling this story?
All right, so yes, wouldn't be fair if I didn't talk about this. So Hollywood has attempted a couple times, well, at least once, to do the Battle of Midway. Coming up in November 2019 is their next attempt at Battle of Midway. And the reason I know that is because myself and Mr. Tilley were the researchers for that movie. So if it's bad, we will not admit that anything we did is in there. But if it's great, you better believe him and I are going to be up there screaming.
Harrison is a general.
There you go.
That is it, yeah.
Woody Harrelson is admiral.
Those of you that are avid Googlers, go ahead and Google Midway 2019, and you'll see some of the actors that are in it. I know the questions they asked me, and I know the questions they asked him. this is going to be a fairly accurate movie. I mean, they were asking me colors of interiors of the dental office on the carriers. So they're trying. I know they got to put some Hollywood in it, and that's okay. You got to tell a story.
They came to us because we had done so much on the Doolittle raid, and they wanted to start Midway with the Doolittle raid, which is kind of a really good starting point. Kind of the same way we wanted to end Pearl Harbor with showing the Doolittle raid so it'll look a little better. So, but anyway, it seems like it's going to come out in November.
November of this year. So we'll see. Again, if it's bad, we had nothing to do with it. All right, if I have nothing else, that concludes. Again, thank you all so much for supporting. Thank you guys for coming.